It's the final day of the 54th World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, is standing by to speak to the CEO of Netbank, Mike Brown. And it's over to you, Xolani.
Good afternoon to yes, indeed. It is the final day here at the World Economic Forum. Not as busy as the last couple of days, as many of the delegates are hauling their bags back home, but there's still a lot of work that is being done here at this alpine town of Davos in Switzerland. Yes, and you're right. I'm being joined by Nedbank CEO Mike Brown to talk about the state of the South African economy, the African economy, and the promise that it holds. Mike, thank you very much for your time. Let's talk about this year's World Economic Forum. It's bigger than ever, more delegates. Does it lead to more better outcomes as far as selling South Africa's story to the rest of the world?
Thanks, and it's great to be with you. Certainly it was a very busy Davos for everybody, and I think the more delegates actually give more energy, more perspectives, and more people here. I think what we've got to realize, though, is that in the current world environment, the reality that we live in today, which is a world that has more conflict than it's seen probably since the 1940s, investors are very, very focused on geopolitical activities and how that may play out economically and indeed for individuals who massively impacted by what we see in the Middle East or what we see in Russia, Ukraine, the potential for conflict in Taiwan. So South Africa, in selling our story, is very much on, I think, the second page of investors' minds at the moment. Front of mind is these big geopolitical risks and how that may impact the global economy, but also investors are conscious that South Africa as an economy has some material challenges, first and foremost of which is our energy shortage and the challenges that we have in logistics. So right now I think we're doing our best to try and keep South Africa on page 2 of investors' destinations, and only once we are able to materially fix energy and logistics, then I think we'll start to see South Africa have the potential for higher levels of growth. Right now, our growth rates are at best 1 to 1.5%, and they're almost capped by our inability to keep the lights on the one hand, or keep logistics and trains moving and ports operating on the other hand. So we absolutely have to fix those to get back on that investment agenda.
Mike, South Africa's story would not be complete without the rest of Africa's story. Really, you need to sell the rest of Africa's story to the investors and the African Continental Free Trade Area. That agreement is crucial because we've seen how a single market will propel the African economy. How best can we make that work, and what promise does it hold?
I certainly think it has an extraordinary amount of promise. Execution will take time, there's no doubt about that. But just to sort of share a point of evidence, the one breakfast that I went to was on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It was completely full. You couldn't fit more people into the room. It was attended by the presidents of Rwanda and Ghana. Minister Patel represented South Africa. Borge Brenda, who's the president of the WEF, addressed the meeting. And there's a lot of excitement around what that can mean. There were a number of global CEOs in attendance, all of whom run multinational organizations that are present across the African continent. So certainly it does hold a lot of promise. But we've also got to be realistic that for South Africa to benefit materially from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we have to have a logistics environment that works materially better than it currently does.
Let's talk about something else. We saw the growth of BRICS, and this is from a South African point of view. We've seen the growth of BRICS Plus now, with Saudi Arabia coming through and joining that particular block of nations. How important is that bloc? It's not a trade bloc per se, but when you look at the countries that are represented in that particular BRICS, you will find that even here at the World Economic Forum, Saudi Arabia is talked about in the context of the Middle East conflict. That's how important it is. So South Africa seemingly is moving in the right spaces, making the right connections. But for people back home, they are asking themselves, what's in it for us who are on the ground? How are we going to benefit from this? Because it looks like we are not, as citizens, going to be benefiting. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think, BRICS as a construct is not something that's discussed in detail here in Davos. And in many ways, BRICS is currently more a political construct than an economic construct. And I think it will take time to see how it develops. And while I think it's very positive for BRICS to have an economy like Saudi join BRICS, given the growth trajectory that economy is on, there's certainly some other members of BRICS that from an economic point of view would raise a lot of questions in respect of some of the more traditional investors in our country.
Let's talk about your last days as the CEO of Netbank. I think you came in as, if I can remember, in March 2010 as CEO. Is more than a decade. How are you feeling as you are probably handing over? It's a handover process. You are going into retirement, as you told me earlier. Are you proud of the state that you are leaving the organization in?
Yes, so you're quite right. It's 14 years in the CEO role, and I was the finance director for 6 years prior to that, so 20 years as a director. And certainly I look back, firstly, with a sense of extraordinary privilege and humility at having had the opportunity to lead Nedbank for such a long period of time. I certainly look back on, saying what I wanted to do when I took on the job. People said, so what do you hope to achieve? And I said, I always hope to leave behind a Nedbank that is better than the one that I inherited. And if I look at what we've been able to achieve over those 14 years, certainly we've had good growth in our customer base. We've completely refreshed the technology stacks of the business to put at the front end of digital. That's lifted our client satisfaction metrics to all-time highs, and I think sets the business up really well for the future. We have, I think, an excellent management team in place, and we've probably most importantly invested a lot of money in the culture and building the right culture in the organization. We've got a sort of fortress balance sheet, to borrow from Jamie Dimon, in terms of capital and liquidity. And we've got a market-leading position in renewable energy finance. So I think hopefully I leave behind an organization that's in great shape, but also one that has, in particular through culture and values, digital, and our renewable energy positioning, platform for growth going forward.
I wanted to talk about that. During that tenure of 14 years, there's been a lot of shifts, and you managed to actually bring in the Green Fund. And I think you were amongst the first banks to do so. You must be quite proud of that and the investments that you've made in the renewable energy space.
Absolutely. I don't claim all of that privilege by any means. I mean, the predecessors who ran Nedbank, either Tom Boardman or Richard Loebscher before him, positioned Nedbank as the green bank, not only in brand and color, but in terms of sustainability, our alignment with things like the World Wildlife Fund, etc. All of that started years and years ago. So that gave us effectively the credibility to be combined with the technical skills of the people in our investment bank at the forefront of financing the green energy transition.
And do you think there will be more of those similar investments as the energy crisis in the country requires investments from a household perspective to the business perspective? Going forward, we've had the promise promises that load shedding will end in 18 months. Load shedding will end at the end of December. Of course, we're now taking those with a pinch of salt. It is an opportunity, this particular load shedding and the investments there. But do you believe that load shedding will end in 18 months, as some people say? Some will say in 18 months, some will say at the end of 2026, and others will even be bolder, saying at the end of December. What do you believe? What should we believe from a captain of industry?
So first and foremost, we've got to be clear. We should never, ever have got into the position that we're currently in. And load shedding has cost the South African economy an extraordinary amount of money over time. That said, we are where we are, and now we've got to try and fix that situation. And if I look at the work that's being done through the Business for South Africa platform, that's now working alongside government on those three important areas: energy, logistics, and crime and corruption. But certainly on the energy front, I do believe the teams that are working there are making good progress. But to really reduce load shedding from, let's say, levels 4, 5, and 6, which are very, very damaging to the economy and investor sentiment, etc., to, let's say, levels 1 or 2, which we can all kind of learn to live with. It's a pain, but it's not that bad. What we really need is a lot more electrons connected to the grid. And what we know as Nedbank is that most of our large mining clients and large industrial clients are all now very far down the track of renewable energy developments. We've underwritten finance on many of those, and they take, unfortunately, 18 to 24 months to go from what we call PowerPoint to power in the flags. So I do have some degree of confidence that in 18 to 24 months' time, as those new sources of generation connect into the grid, load shedding probably won't disappear, but it will reduce to those levels 1 or 2, which means that South Africa as an economy has the capacity then for 3 to 4% growth rates. Right now, there is simply no capacity for more than a 1.5% growth rate.
As we conclude, and before I let you go, a lot of households are worried about where their personal finances are, driven by the rise in inflation, in interest rates, and also driven by that runaway inflation. We've seen it coming below 5% to about 4.8%, and as the Reserve Bank has said, we need to see that being maintained over time before we see interest rates coming down. As consumers are out there watching you at home, wanting to know from you, where do you think the interest rates trajectory will go, as some expect for the cuts to start perhaps at the beginning of next year?
Well, what I've learned over many years is that whatever you project is usually wrong, because data changes, and if you ask me in a month's time on new data, I might say something different. But based on data that we have today, look, I think the good news for consumers is that inflation globally does look to have peaked and is now coming down. There's lots of debates as to how sticky it might be and how slow, but it is coming down. And the same is taking place in South Africa. So broadly speaking, what that also means is that interest rates have probably peaked, and any further increases in interest rates are very unlikely, unless there's a big geopolitical event which then pushes up the price of oil and inflation goes up again. Those are possibilities. But interest rates have probably peaked and will begin to drift down. I think, and certainly listening here in Davos, that central bankers are going to be very cautious in reducing interest rates. The last thing they want to do is cut interest rates too soon, see inflation move back up again, and then have to lift rates. That's absolutely a central banker's nightmare. That said, our central case for this year is that inflation will continue to drift back down. It'll probably average somewhere around about 5% for the full year in 2024, but point-in-time inflation will be 4.5% or thereabouts in the second half of this year, which is the middle of the Reserve Bank's target range. And if that does play out, then we would expect interest rates to cut probably 100 basis points during the course of this year. Now, that's good if you're a borrower. It's not so good if you're a saver. There's both sides to these things. with the first cut of 25 basis points we're predicting in May of this year.
Mike, thank you very much for your time here at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, catching up with him about all things South Africa and the African continent as far as the World Economic Forum is concerned. Back to you in studio, Dudu.
Xolani Mbanjwa is Newzroom Africa's business editor. Thank you very much, Xolani.